Hey everybody, this is my gourami tank, and today I want to talk about the micronutrient supplement that I've been using in this tank. Actually, I've been using it in all my tanks, so at some point we're probably going to walk around the room and have a look at a few other tanks. But I want to start with this tank because this is the one that I began using the treatment for specifically. And the reason I started using it was because of this floating water sprite. And if you will look at it very carefully, it's kind of hard to tell. You will see some of the areas where the plant looks sort of lacy and spindly, and then other parts where you can see nice, full, thick leaves. There's a good example of exactly what I'm talking about. You see the lacy, spindly leaves, and then you see the roots hanging down through the rest of it, and then the roots, of course, are attached to the thicker, fuller leaves. Well, the thick, full leaves are what this plant is supposed to look like. There's a better example of some of the broader leaves that are growing off of these little babies. So the plant itself, the mother plant, is a prolific producer of offspring, but the plant itself is odd looking. So I have speculated that it is because of a nutrient deficiency. The fact that it's floating in the water rather than rooted down into the substrate prevents it from getting any of the micronutrients that are in this substrate. I use a very good, high quality planted substrate that provides all of those micronutrients and minerals and trace elements that you don't get in something like simple aquarium gravel. But when you get into floating plants, they don't have access to those nutrients. So I decided as an experiment we would start treating this tank with Seachem's Flourish. I used to use this all the time way back in the day, and I kind of stopped using it. This is what it is. I don't know why my camera doesn't like to focus anymore. But it is a comprehensive supplement for the planted aquarium. It contains macro and micronutrients, but it does not contain any significant amount of nitrogen or phosphates. Typically, when you have plant food that contains macronutrients, you'll get the standard NPK, which is the nitrogen, the phosphates, and the potassium. We don't need extra nitrates and phosphates in our fish tank for the most part. At least I don't. I know I've got tons of nitrogen in there already. So this is a good supplement that provides you with your other macronutrients, such as potassium, without actually blowing up your nitrates and your phosphates. And then, of course, it also adds all of your little oddball stuff like zinc and manganese and cadmium and all of the little trace elements that you need for your plants. So it is pretty good stuff, but I've always sort of managed without it for the simple fact that I keep fairly easy to grow plants. My philosophy is always put it in the tank, and if it grows, it grows. If it doesn't, that's not a plant I can grow, and I try something else. This tank here is a great example. You can see a few little plants hanging on. They've been in there for years. They've never really amounted to anything. This is a tank that has inert substrate. It's that hard plastic aquarium. They call it gravel, but they should put quote marks around it. And you can't grow crap in it unless you put other nutrients in the tank, and you probably have to put ferts and tabs and everything else. And so this tank doesn't really have much in the way of rooted plants. I am working on getting a piece of anubias attached to that wood, and you can see I have a Marimo moss ball there, but moss balls don't grow rooted into the substrate, and they're not moss, they're actually algae, and algae does not need much to grow, so they're not difficult. I've also got some java that's barely hanging on and is rooted to a piece of wood, and whenever the java is rooted to the wood, it is actually stealing nutrients from the wood, so that doesn't need the micronutrients put in the water. And then, of course, I have more of the floating water sprite. I have water sprite in almost all my tanks. I really like it a lot. I almost think of it as like a signature plant in my tanks. So with this tank, I'm experiencing a huge explosion in growth, which I kind of expected, but it's still surprising me a little bit. I'm not seeing any different yet on the mother plant. I'm still getting the odd spindly little leaves, but I am getting a lot of babies growing off of it. I've been using this maybe 2 to 3 weeks now, and I'm getting a lot of additional green and vibrant growth off of my Java in here. And the real thing I've noticed is my plants that actually are rooted in and are in the planted substrate. I use Eco Complete, and it's really good stuff, like I said. So my temple plant and my red tiger lotus have always done pretty well to begin with, and now that I've been dosing with this micronutrient, this Flourish, these have just gone crazy. I've removed 3 of these runners here recently, and I've got 2 more that are up there now. Let's try to get a look in here and see what they look like from the top side down, if I can do this without knocking anything loose. So that's what they look like once they reach the surface. They actually do float and form a dry surface, so if you had a frog or some sort of small animal like that in a tank, they could really just get up out of the water and sit on those pads. Now, those are just, you can think of them as scouts, I guess. They look for the surface. Once they find the surface, all of the rest of that plant will begin looking for the surface as well, and pretty soon I'm going to have a leggy plant rather than a bushy plant. So it's important for me to get in there and keep on top of those little runners. And this is getting so thick and bushy and close to the surface that I'm probably going to need to get in there and trim back some of these larger leaves anyway, and allow some of this new growth down here in the bottom to come in and fill this all out. So that explosion has happened since I've been using this Flourish. This tank over here is another one. This has inert substrate, but most of the plants I have in here are either floating water sprite, or it's Java or Anubias, which, you know, again, it's stealing its nutrients from the wood that it's grabbed a hold of. Or I would imagine if it's the Java that's growing on the rocks, it could probably even get some trace elements from the rocks themselves. I'm not sure about that, but I would suspect that is probably the case. So again, with this tank, it's very low nutrient need plants that I'm now dosing with all of these micronutrients, and again, I'm just seeing all of this nice new green growth. And my Anubias is taking off. I've got new shoots coming off of this like crazy. So it's really making a big difference, I think. My Black Ghost Knifefish tank, I just trimmed this one back not long ago. I've done a big water change and we're in the process of treating for cyanobacteria. But even since I've cut it back, you can see I've got branching growth there. You can see that sort of pinkish growth back there. That's all new growth coming in where I cut it. So this is not only recovering, but it's beginning to fill out and become thick again. And this tank is currently not housing any of the treatment. I've done water changes and everything else. We're going to get back to treating this tank once I'm done with the cyanobacteria treatment, which is coming along nicely, by the way. If you follow along regularly, you can see how much better the Java back there looks. That stuff was covered in green slime not long ago, and it's really starting to look a whole lot better in here. This tank is my, hey, we got to see my crayfish take a dive. This tank, I'm kind of giving up on the plants because of that crayfish. It's pretty much impossible to have a planted tank and a crayfish tank at the same time. So not a lot to see here, and I've not even been wasting my time dosing this tank. Again, not really much to worry about. This is another tank that's got a planted substrate, but for some reason none of the fish in here have been doing very well. Let me get my light resituated there. So now that I've been dosing this, I also am noticing some nice lush green growth developing on all of that temple plant. This is the same kind of substrate. It's a planted substrate, but it's sand instead of the gravel version. And yet, for whatever reason, the temple plant that was in here, which is most of what you see, I know it doesn't really look like temple plant because it's growing so raggedy looking and it's so, you know, torn up. But that is temple plant, and it is starting to green up again now that I'm putting these micronutrients in there. So I guess the long and short of what I'm saying as I walk around and give you visual examples of what we're looking at is that you can have a tank that will grow plants without dosing it and without, again, remember, I do have the planted substrate. I don't have a whole lot going on in any of the tanks that have a neutral substrate or an inert substrate. But in my planted tanks, I do have the planted substrate, and that's pretty much all I've done. And up until now, you've more or less, if you follow along, you see what my tanks have looked like, and you've seen the level of success I've had. But then you can look at what's happened in the last couple of days. This tank doesn't really count. I have been putting in here as well, but this tank is a little bit lush just because I've just started it up. I actually think we're going to have some issues with this tank in the very near future. So make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss that. This is going to be a cool tank to work with. But while you can have a planted tank without a lot of fuss, you don't have to necessarily use the root tabs and everything, it helps. If you're willing to do it, and if you want to put your trace elements in there and your foods and your ferts and everything, it really does make a significant difference. Again, if you're new to my channel, or if this is the first video you're seeing, you don't have a whole lot to base this on. But if you're a regular viewer, or if you want to go back and look at some of my older videos of this tank, even from just a few weeks ago, you will see a big difference. And it really has been since I've started putting this Flourish in there. So make what you want of that. Again, it's not magic. And it does say specifically that this is meant to be used in conjunction with other foods. If you've got a high-tech planted tank or a low-tech planted tank, this is very specific about the fact that it does not have your standard NPK dosing. So if you are looking for macronutrients, you need to look elsewhere in addition to this. This will give you your trace, but you would still need to do more of the macro with another type of treatment. This is meant to be used in conjunction with that. So again, it's pretty good stuff. Don't know, what that was worth to you or not, but if you watched and you listened, I hope you got something out of it. Feel free to ask any questions, leave any comments below. Hope you enjoyed looking at my tanks as we walked around the room. I'll see you real soon on the next one. Thanks a lot.